Hi, Jop.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good today.
Thank you very much for letting me come here to interview you. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming. I'm Jop de Vrieze. I'm a science journalist based in Amsterdam. I'm a freelancer since around 2008. After I finished my master's my bachelor's in biomedical sciences and my master's in science communication. And I've been working for myself since then.
So you're a science investigative reporter, as I remember when we had our
Yeah,
first
nowadays.
conversation.
Yeah.
Tell me what that actually entails.
Well, yeah, I started as an ordinary science journalist, and along the way, I came to realize that we shouldn't be just reporting on what progress science is bringing us, or what new articles are being published, or what kind of cool stuff there's out there. But we should also be, as a critical reporter, or like the third estate, but then not only on government or companies, but also on science, because science has a lot of power. So that's how I ended up becoming a investigative science journalist, being not just only critical at what's in the papers, but also at all these forces that are behind the scenes in science, and also on the interface of science and society, government, and commercial and industry.
So what is the fundamental difference, I suppose, between a journalist, a science journalist versus a normal journalist?
I think a normal, if you would be able to describe what a normal journalist is, should also act like a science journalist, but a science journalist is more able to find the experts, to read the scientific literature, but also being able to critically read it if we are doing our jobs well. Not just saying, I found a paper in this and this journal that shows this and this and this, and then use it in my reporting, but also being able to say, okay, this paper this science is reliable or not, or you could interpret it like this or like that. So yeah, if you're doing your job well, you can add a different layer to your reporting.
Okay. What do you actually do in terms of verifying the information? Because I'm guessing that is part of your remit, right? When you look at a paper, you look at a phenomenon, you go and verify the information. I guess you're reading a lot. So how do you do that verification process?
Well, first of all, you try to find a lot of papers. I have these maps tiny on my computer all the time for all the specific magazines I'm writing for, but then all the specific topics, and constantly collecting and not reading everything that I'm collecting, but constantly keeping up. Oh, this is interesting for that. And talking to the right experts on those topics, but also trying to figure out, okay, who's this person in this field? Who are they connected to? Not only just connected to the industry, but that can be a thing, but also they're competing with that group, and this is that theory, and this is that idea, and how the fields are moving, and then get more of a sense of, and not just, okay, this is what we know and this is what we don't know. Okay. Sounds a little bit abstract, right?
It is a little bit abstract, because it makes me think. Like, for example, you're looking at a phenomenon and you know the people that are involved in the field, right? Do you talk to these people as well to get their opinion?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say you've talked to two different people and they have opposing views. How do you find that middle ground after talking to the various parties that are involved in a particular situation?
Yeah. Well, one thing is very attractive to do is talk to them, both of them, and then say, here's this what they say, this is what they say, and leave it there. That has different flaws, because, well, you're just leaving the decision up to the reader. It can be a good thing to do, but it's kind of tricky. The other thing is that you can create a false balance. So if that person has a lot of good research behind it or good evidence, and the other is just only very controversial type, you don't frame that in the right way or give the context, and you're creating a false balance of, okay, this is their view, or their view. Same as with that. For instance, the famous example is the vaccine debate or climate. Then, oh, there's climate change, and then no, there's no climate change, and then you have this. The audience thinks, oh, there's just two different streams of thinking here.
I guess what I'm asking about also is bias.
Mm-hmm.
As an investigative journalist, as any investigative journalist, I think that what I would feel is that you have to be very, very careful about your own bias,
Mm-hmm.
because you'd be talking to people who probably are biased, especially in science.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you create a balance between what is a fact, what is a bias, and your own bias even actually?
Yeah, well, I don't have the illusion that I will be able to get rid of any bias. Trying to be aware of your own perspective. I would call it more like a perspective and like values that you carry along with you, that will partly shape your angle of your story. I think if you're open and transparent about what's your angle, what the questions are you're raising, then it's okay if you're not like giving that Wikipedia type of so-called objective overview, because it can be useless, but it can also be like, I wouldn't call it fake, but like an illusion to say, oh, if as long as I make it such a setup, then it's not biased.
That's really interesting. So let's talk about now a little bit about headlines and what catches the eye. I mean, one thing that I struggle with when I write for my blog, for example, is, how do I make sure that I get the audience and have them stay and read what it is that I've written?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I find that, science stories can be very, very long, and they can be very detailed, and, I can imagine that loses a lot of interest, or, people just get lost reading all of that detail. So how do you find the balance between, sensationalism and fact when you talk about science journalism?
Yeah. Well, first of all, if you need the headline to get the readers attracted, then something's wrong with the piece. I'm convinced that by asking the right questions or choosing the right angle for the story, even if it's written by a scientist itself, him or herself, then you have to go back one step in the process and do that again. So if you have a very boring and uninteresting piece, you cannot solve that with a good headline. So the headline should sort of pop up out of the story, and of course you could sort of oversell the story by making it more attractive. I think then, okay, you might get some more readers initially, but then they will be disappointed. Yeah. But then next to that, there's like certain types of headlines that work well. That's what we know from all these digital A/B testing, and like, so this person has, or first he or she thought this and now that, and but those are those very useful and successful headlines are often very applicable in science. Like, science is a lot about changing your mind on things, about struggles, about the personal, but you have to take the personal angle instead of the technical angle that often has been pushed by the scientists themselves.
Sure. So we all know this PhD comics
Mm-hmm.
strip, right, where you have a discovery that somebody publishes in a novel, in a journal,
Mm-hmm.
and then at the end of the cycle, his grandmother is wearing a tinfoil hat because she says, "Hey, XYZ causes whatever.
Yeah.
Ergo, I'm protecting myself."
Yeah.
So I think that is a very, that is a tempting wheel to be trapped in.
Yeah.
What do you do about that? So how do you, again, sensationalism? How do you make sure that people keep reading and that you don't over sensationalize as well?
I think like in general we have this climate now, the whole culture of like everybody's being pushed for trying to get attention from the audience, or like first the scientists, they need media attention, or they are told that it's good for them. The institutions, the universities, they want that. The press officers are being pushed to do that, so they tend to oversell the results of the research. In particular, when there's a new paper out, they make a press release, and And it's been shown now in several studies that they tend to oversell the results, and then the journalist uh, will do the same, or might not even go further, but at least not push back against that. What I try to do, if I use, I don't do a lot of science news anymore. Because of that, I don't really like that. Okay, and all the colleagues are reading the same stuff, and okay, but sometimes, but then you have to be critical at what they are writing and go back to the paper, talk to the researcher, and talk to other researchers, at least one. So to ask them what they like, whether they like the methodology, the conclusions, whether they think it's really adds to the base of knowledge you already have. But I do realize that we are still in this climate that a lot of the journalists are not really science journalists that are reporting on the news and just using those press releases to get the clicks.
If I understand correctly, that's where the investigative part comes in. That you are not
Yeah, I think that's not just only I think that I wouldn't call that investigative yet.
Okay.
Because so my investigative work is more like on months of work for one article. And this is just like being more critical and being more aware of your position as a critical reviewer and not just as a cheerleader, as some people would say it, cheerleader of science. And so being a little bit more critical and not always. So that was one anecdote that I sometimes I tell that when I started dating my wife, who was then my girlfriend, of course, she was wondering how come that scientists are always happy when you call them. And that made me realize, yeah, they shouldn't always be happy when I call them. Because I might end up being very critical of their work or their what they do it for, and asking the difficult questions that they sometimes ask themselves as well, but don't want to answer or don't have the answer for. So that's pushed me to become more like that. And then sometimes I end up with scientists not so happy, calling me up even sometimes, like, oh, what did you do? And then I feel proud of that because that's what we should do.
Create controversy.
Yeah, not so much create controversy, but not let them just get their media attention with some kind of funny study that they published and everybody liked because it was so media savvy.
Very fair. In this culture of too long didn't read, how do you deal with that as a journalist?
The fact that everybody is so has a short attention span.
Yes.
Well, if you have just good stories, and not only stories, I'm not talking about narrative journalism, like just interesting, compelling stories. They will make time, but you shouldn't expect everybody to read it. There's so much out there, but a lot of people, and the advantage of this time is that through social media and other, like, everybody is so connected, so it's a lot easier to reach the people that will be interested. So it used to be like everybody had their newspaper and then some magazine maybe, and you would just publish for that newspaper or that magazine and only their readers would see it. But now I will publish my article, and if I'm lucky I'll publish it online, or maybe it's in Blendel, the online kiosk, and then all the other people can reach it as well, and through those channels they will. And so that's the other side. And then they will take time to write it, to read it.
So let's talk a little bit about the uncertainty of science.
Mm-hmm.
So we all know that science can be based on p-values, based on all of these things that butter could be good for you one day and bad for you the next day. How do you convey this uncertainty to your audience? Because personally, I think that when you talk about science, especially things like very controversial topics like climate change and vaccines. Well, actually, those are quite straightforward. But still, there are controversial topics out there, and there are scientists themselves are not even sure.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you actually convey this uncertainty to your audience?
Well, first of all, in your own reporting, you're always trying to focus on both sides. So this is what we now have been becoming, it's becoming clear or clearer or less fuzzy. And this is what we still don't know, or these are the new questions that have popped up. And what we also try to do as science journalists, I'm not the only one, trying to be critical as well, like on social media or in debates or wherever, to if someone else is making big claims, to say, okay, let's not go too far and claim this, because we might end up having a boy cry wolf scenario where everybody says, okay, you're claiming it again, and they won't believe you anymore.
So your credibility is sort of on the line, I suppose.
Yeah, I think we have to sort of constantly deserve that again. It's like we say in Dutch, credibility, or something like credibility, comes, how do they say it? Comes by foot and leaves by horse.
Okay.
So you have to constantly try to build it up, and then it can be gone the next day. So you have to be very aware of that as a science journalist, but also for our role in democracy, so to say.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I think that the biggest issue is that, you know, the average Joe on the street, you know, if he reads science stories, he's not always certain about what to believe. And I think this is, you know, the biggest thing these days, especially with hashtag fake news and all of these other things. How do you convey to the audience that, hey, what I actually am writing to you is, you know, what we know about this particular problem right now. Sure, we don't know everything about it, and things could change in the future. But how, you know, this is the state of the art right now. And I think this is, I mean, in my opinion, this is an important message. Do you convey that in your stories as well?
Yeah, that's one of the ways. The other way is by really showing the science in working, the way it's being investigated. And maybe the average Joe would not be interested to read all those long form stories about the whole process. But I do think if you make it, if you put effort in doing that in an attractive and in an easy way, they will understand, as long as you not make it too technical. Then you're showing, and then it becomes reasonable that, okay, if you study it like this with this amount of people, or by asking questionnaires instead of measuring exactly, yeah, I can imagine that it's not very certain. So you shouldn't underestimate even the average citizen. Maybe you should you should not overestimate their attention span, maybe, or their time they're willing to spend on topics that you find interesting. But then you have to do your best to get them interested, and then they can handle it.
So, in your experience, that you've done this, you know, you've been a journalist for a pretty long time. What do you think is still lacking when it comes to making science accessible to everybody, or to the persons, you know, anybody on the street that is interested in a particular topic? I mean, for example, for a mother who wants to know whether vaccinating her child is going to be a good idea or not, or, you know, to the person who's trying to be, you know, recycle, you know, because of the climate change and all of this. Like, how do you, what challenges do you see there still?
I don't see it as my own challenge or my own mission to make science accessible. It sounds weird maybe for a science journalist, but I use science, and I don't see science as a goal or as a, but yeah, like for most people, it's just, they get interested in a certain topic when it becomes relevant to them in a practical way. So before buying a house, they're trying to look for ways to understand how mortgage works and how building constructions work, and then they're able to get a lot of complex information. Not everybody will be as able to look at all the architecture and all the details, but so you shouldn't have the illusion that everybody will just start reading books about stuff that they're just only interested in, like in a abstract way. But we should be able to then deliver that information, the right information then, and because nowadays they end up Googling and not knowing what sources are the right ones to go to, or they distrust those sources for certain reasons. and then they end up getting the wrong information, and they're sort of prepped with the wrong information. For instance, with vaccines, start reading just before their children will have to get them, then they start having those doubts, and they're no longer able to well, just get a normal, balanced view on it. I think that's part of the challenges for science communicators and science journalists as well, like to get the right information at the right place to the people that are desperate to get it at the time.
That's really interesting, because I mean the biggest challenge to news these days, or to science these days, or to any kind of news, is the fact that there is the internet, which is full of unverified information that people consume. And I don't know what the ratio is, but how much of it is real and how much of it is fake? I mean, there are like university courses that are being started these days to distinguish between fake news and real news. So that is the challenge, I think any journalist, whether science or not, has today.
And I think that it's even more complex, because if it would be so easy to distinguish between real and fake, it would be one online course and you will be done.
True.
But there's so much shades of gray, so many shades of gray there between like very reliable and even uncertain information and downright lies or propaganda. And that makes it so complex, even for us as science journalists. I'm trying to, for instance, focusing on the vaccines again, I'm also trying to take those criticisms seriously without letting them just spread their conspiracy theories. But sometimes they're asking the right questions, so then you have to still move there a little bit, but not too far, because then you end up being used by them. So that makes it very complex.
It's a crazy new world out there. I think navigating it must be quite difficult. I mean, there are some things that are very straightforward, but other things are just
and I think one of the frustrations for science journalists, I guess, is like we're preaching a lot for the choir, because people tend to skip those pages in the newspaper, or and so where we all are spreading our nuanced and very well researched message, and only a small even like from the educated audience, only a small bit will read that, because the rest will think, okay, it's not for me, or it's too complex, or I already know it.
So last question, is there a story that you want to tell us about? So the most controversial perhaps, or the most successful? Do you have an example of a story for us that you've written?
Well, there's a couple of that I'm rather proud of, from the just about science or the scientific enterprise, and some more stories coming up about the interface between science and society. But there was one like very personal story that I'm still most proud of, that came not because I was just doing scientific research or looking at scientific literature, but something that happened in my personal life, which was that our first son was stillborn. And my wife is like I said, an investigative reporter, and I'm a science reporter, and we ended up researching that whole field, both the scientific and also like the healthcare system, and ended up writing that story. I think everything that we already discussed in this conversation came together, because yes, can you write that story without being biased? No, but we are constantly, from the beginning, clear about our perspective. So we are looking at the system of healthcare and at the science from a perspective of parents that have lost a child and want to prevent other people from having the same thing. And so that gave us the perspective and also the strength to write that story, and it really worked out well, because it was I think everybody in the whole sector, not only the birth care but also in healthcare, read the story, and they really it really resonated. Also among other parents, a lot of people were sort of warned, and they were empowered to be more loud in the speaking when they were discussing with their midwives or doctors. So then it really all comes together. So you can use your scientific background, you can use your sort of journalist's gut feeling that something's wrong, and you also make it practical. I think that, yeah, that I don't think I will ever be able to do that in that way again, even in the next 20 years.
That's amazing. Well, Jop, this was such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time, and I really appreciate it. I'll be publishing this on wetalkscience.com very shortly. And again, I want to say thank you.
Thanks.